What happens when the richest, most powerful economy in the world just collapses? Picture the roaring heights of the 1920s. Wall Street is booming, turning everyday clerks into paper millionaires. American streets are packed with newly minted consumers, banks are absolutely flush with cash, and factories are running around the clock to meet endless demand. Now, I want you to imagine all of it coming to a grinding, catastrophic halt in a matter of days.
In 1929, America entered an unprecedented economic disaster that changed the country forever. We aren't talking about a simple market correction or a temporary dip in production. This was the beginning of the Great Depression, a punishing, relentless decade of misery that would literally strip millions of their livelihoods, their homes, and their fundamental dignity.
To truly grasp the sheer terror of this fall, we really have to look at the dizzying heights of the 1920s first. On the surface, the wealth was intoxicating. You had automobiles and radios flying off assembly lines, giving birth to a modern consumer culture unlike anything the world had ever seen. But beneath this golden veneer, there was a deeply fragile foundation. The whole boom was fueled almost entirely by overspeculation, reckless lending, and a banking system that was teetering right on the edge of a cliff.
So America looked wealthier than ever before. Yet beneath the surface, the structural pillars were beginning to snap. The roaring prosperity of the Jazz Age was, in many ways, a spectacular illusion. It was a fragile house of cards built on a mountain of unregulated debt and dangerously risky financial bets. Millions of shares were being bought on borrowed money, and that fragile foundation was about to shatter completely.
Part 1. The Great Crash.
The dominoes fell with terrifying speed. In early October 1929, this quiet, mounting panic began to creep across Wall Street as seasoned investors started quietly pulling their money. Then came October 24th, Black Thursday. The floor literally fell out. Blind panic gripped the stock exchange. Traders were screaming to sell, and prices plummeted in an absolute freefall. Just 5 days later, on October 29th, Black Tuesday cemented the total collapse. Terrified crowds gathered outside financial institutions as ticker tapes delivered nothing but ruin.
In a matter of hours, billions of dollars simply evaporated into thin air. Lifetimes of wealth were wiped out before the closing bell even rang. Paper fortunes just vanished. Investors who had leveraged their entire lives on margin calls and unchecked speculation lost absolutely everything, sending shock and despair rippling across the financial district. But you see, the true tragedy of 1929 was that the bleeding didn't stay contained to Wall Street.
Part 2. When banks started failing.
The nightmare quickly spread to Main Street, and it took the devastating form of bank runs. Everyday Americans watched the chaos unfold in the daily papers and rushed in a blind panic to their local community banks to withdraw their life savings. But when they arrived, they were met with locked doors and empty vaults. It is one thing for a wealthy Wall Street speculator to lose a stock portfolio. It is an entirely different, soul-crushing tragedy for a working family to realize that every single dollar they had ever saved was gone forever.
Part 3. Millions left without work.
With credit entirely frozen and local banks shuttered, mass unemployment struck the nation like a relentless plague. Factories that were humming just months earlier went completely silent, locking their doors indefinitely. And the immediate human result was seen right on the sidewalks. Endless, desperate breadlines started forming in every major American city. Think about this. These were proud, hardworking people, now forced to stand in freezing weather for hours just for a single crust of bread or a watered-down bowl of soup, searching desperately for any labor they could find.
Behind every staggering unemployment statistic was an agonizing human tragedy. For so many families, the American dream had suddenly become a daily struggle just to find food, shelter, and work. The prospect of starvation and absolute homelessness wasn't some distant, abstract fear anymore. It was a grim reality knocking right at their front door. Parents were literally skipping meals so their children could eat, and millions of men took to the rails, wandering the country in search of a miracle.
This unprecedented wave of mass evictions gave birth to a grim new American landscape, Hoovervilles. These were sprawling, makeshift shanty towns built by the newly destitute and the displaced. They were named in bitter mockery of President Herbert Hoover, whom many people blamed for the crisis. Constructed of rusted tin, cardboard, tar paper, and scrap wood, these sprawling camps became the miserable, unsanitary last refuge for millions of families who had literally nowhere else to go.
Part 4. Nature's Wrath.
And just when it seemed like the country could endure no more, a catastrophic environmental disaster compounded the economic collapse, the Dust Bowl. Decades of deep, aggressive plowing had systematically stripped the Great Plains of its protective topsoil. So when a historic, punishing drought arrived, the relentless winds picked up the dry earth, creating these apocalyptic walls of black dust. It choked livestock, destroyed machinery, and literally blotted out the midday sun. Thriving farms turned into barren wastelands, forcing thousands of starving families to pack whatever they had left into jalopies and flee west toward California.
Part 5. Roosevelt and the New Deal.
The election of 1932 brought Franklin D. Roosevelt into office with a massive mandate for immediate, aggressive action. His response was a sweeping, unprecedented wave of federal interventions known as the New Deal. He instituted emergency banking reforms to immediately halt the bleeding of those bank runs. He launched massive federal jobs programs, putting shovels back into the hands of desperate men to build the nation's bridges, roads, and parks. And critically, this era introduced Social Security, creating a permanent national safety net where absolutely none had existed before.
Now, as an explainer of the historical record, it's important to note that the New Deal sparked an intense debate that actually continues to this very day. Was it a complete success or a deeply flawed experiment? On one hand, it undeniably provided crucial, desperate relief and permanently reshaped the federal government's role in American society. But on the other hand, many economists and historians point out that it wasn't an overnight cure-all. Despite the massive deficit spending and all those newly created programs, national unemployment remains stubbornly, painfully high for years to come.
The timeline of recovery was agonizingly slow and deeply fractured. In the early 1930s, the economy was entirely defined by mass unemployment and closed factories. Moving into the mid to late 1930s, the New Deal spurred gradual, uneven improvements with government-funded jobs, but private industry still lagged behind significantly. The true definitive turning point didn't actually arrive until the 1940s. It was the onset of World War II, with its insatiable demand for explosive war production and massive mandatory job creation, that finally dragged the United States out of the Great Depression.
Part 6. A Dark American Legacy.
The economy did eventually recover, but the nation was permanently scarred. To prevent history from repeating itself, modern banking regulations were established, protecting civilian life savings from sudden evaporation. The size, scope, and expectation of the federal government expanded forever. But the most profound legacy? That was entirely psychological. A generation of Americans who survived the breadlines and the apocalyptic dust storms never trusted banks, the stock market, or the illusion of easy credit in the exact same way ever again.
The Great Depression was far more than just a financial crash. It fundamentally changed the way Americans understood security, work, the role of their government, and the extreme fragility of the American dream. It proved, brutally and definitively, that what happens in the wealthy, insulated corridors of Wall Street directly dictates the survival of every ordinary street in the nation.
I want you to think about this for a second. Imagine losing your job, your life savings, and your family home, all within the span of a few short years, with absolutely no guarantee that things would ever get better. If you were thrust into that terrifying reality, what would you have done?
So, was the Great Depression the darkest economic period in American history? Let us know what you think. Subscribe to Rap Kick for more dark American history, untold stories, and documentaries.